The beggar she kissed at the alpha mating ceremony was what alphas fear. The kiss had already ended when Mara realized the music had stopped, not because she'd rebelled, but because the Great Hall forgot how to make sound. 100 unmated females froze in their silk gowns. Candles leaned, breath caught. On the marble dais, the alphas went perfectly still. Varric stood at the center, in crimson. This silence wasn't respectful. It was suffocating. Mara slowly pulled back from the beggar's mouth. Her lips still tingled. Ash knelt where discarded food was thrown, filthy rags, bowed head, invisible by design. No one was ever meant to look there. She waited for it. The shout, the enforcers, the punishment. Instead, she saw something else in the alpha's eyes. Not rage, recognition. And when Ash finally lifted his head from the shadows, unhurried, patient, ancient, his gaze locked with Varric's across the hall. The Crimson Alpha took an involuntary step backward. His boot scraped stone. The sound cracked the silence wide open. That was when Mara understood. She hadn't defied a ceremony. She had awakened something the alphas buried beneath marble, ritual, and lies. And now, it was looking back at them. Before we go any further, if you're drawn to stories where a single choice shatters power, tradition, and fate, like this video. And if you want more dark, faceless stories where the unseen rise and the forgotten strike back, subscribe to the channel. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The Alpha's Rage. Varric's roar shattered the silence like a fist through glass. "Seize them!" The command cracked across the great hall with all the fury of a challenged alpha, his face contorted into something between rage and something else, something that looked almost like panic beneath the crimson of his formal robes. Spittle flew from his lips as he jabbed a jeweled finger toward the corner where Mara still knelt beside Ash. The enforcers hesitated, just for a heartbeat, just long enough for everyone to notice. "I said, seize them!" Varric's voice climbed higher, shriller, the dominant baritone cracking at the edges. His hand shook as he gripped the marble railing of the dais. That nothing dared to defile the sacred ceremony. She touched the filth in front of the entire pack. Two enforcers finally lurched forward, their movements stiff and unwilling, as if wading through water. They grabbed Mara by her arms, hauling her to her feet. She didn't resist. Her legs had gone numb anyway, shock and adrenaline warring in her chest as the reality of what she'd done crashed over her in waves. But when the third enforcer reached for Ash, his hand stopped. Not because Ash moved, he didn't. He remained kneeling in his pile of rags and discarded food scraps, his head still bowed, his breathing so quiet he might have been carved from shadow itself. The enforcer's hand simply stopped, hovering, trembling. "Touch him!" Varric shrieked from the dais, his carefully cultivated authority dissolving into something raw and ugly. "Drag that creature to the cells! Make an example of them both!" The enforcer's jaw clenched, sweat beaded on his temple. With visible effort, he forced his hand down onto Ash's shoulder. Nothing happened. Ash didn't fight, didn't flinch. He simply stood, unfolding from his crouch with an eerie, fluid grace that seemed wrong for someone so filthy and broken. The rags hung from his frame like funeral shrouds. His face remained hidden in the shadow of his matted hair. But his eyes, Mara caught a glimpse of them as the enforcers shoved her past him, toward the hall's side exit. Those eyes weren't human, weren't wolf. They were depthless and patient, like looking into a well that had no bottom, only cold and the promise of something ancient waiting in the dark. The enforcer, holding Ash's shoulder, yanked his hand back as if burned. "I don't care if you have to break his legs." Varric was pacing now, his polished boots clicking frantically against the marble. The other alphas on the dais stood frozen, watching him unravel, watching and saying nothing. "He humiliated me, humiliated us, in front of the entire pack. This is treason. This is—" "He's walking," one of the enforcers muttered, his voice barely audible. And he was. Ash moved forward on his own, bare feet silent on the gleaming floor, following the enforcers who were technically supposed to be dragging him. He walked like a man who had already chosen his destination, like the chains they would put on him were a courtesy he was allowing, not a restraint. Mara twisted in her captor's grip to look back at Varric. The Crimson Alpha had stopped pacing. He stood at the edge of the dais, both hands white-knuckled on the railing, staring after them with an expression she'd never seen on an Alpha's face before. Fear. Raw, undisguised, primal fear. Behind him, the ceremonial candles guttered and went out, one by one as Ash passed beneath them. The shadows in the great hall grew longer, hungrier, reaching toward him like old friends welcoming something home after a long, long absence. And in that darkness, Mara heard Varric whisper something to himself, a prayer or a curse, she couldn't tell which. It can't be. They're all gone. They're all supposed to be gone. The heavy doors boomed shut behind them, sealing Mara and Ash away from the ceremony, away from the light, away from the world that had just realized it had made a terrible mistake centuries ago. A mistake that was now walking calmly toward its cells, wearing rags and silence like a king.
Chapter 2. The Cells. The holding cells beneath the great hall smelled of damp stone and old fear. Mara's hands wouldn't stop shaking as the iron door clanged shut behind her, the sound reverberating through her bones like a death knell. The enforcers had shoved her inside without ceremony, their faces carefully blank, professionally detached. But she'd seen the way they'd released Ash into the adjacent cell, quickly, their fingers not quite touching him, as if proximity alone might contaminate them. Now silence pressed against her ears like water. Mara wrapped her arms around herself, the thin fabric of her gray dress doing nothing against the cold seeping up from the stone floor. What had she done? What had she done? Varric would make an example of her. Public punishment. Exile if she was lucky. Death if he wanted to prove a point about insubordination. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. "You're afraid." The voice cut through the darkness between their cells, not loud but present, filling the space the way a bell's resonance fills a chapel. It didn't sound like it came from a beggar's throat. It sounded like bedrock speaking, like the earth itself had found words. Mara's head snapped toward the bars separating them. In the dim torchlight filtering down from above, she could make out Ash's silhouette. He sat against the far wall of his cell, cross-legged in his rags, perfectly still, watching her with those impossible eyes. "Of course I'm afraid," she whispered, hating how her voice cracked. "Varric's going to kill us." No. The certainty in that single syllable made her breath catch. "He won't come down here," Ash continued, his tone conversational, almost gentle. "Not tonight. Maybe not ever. He's too frightened of what he might find." "You?" The word came out sharper than Mara intended. "You're a beggar.
You're nobody. What could he possibly—" "You saw me." "At the ceremony," he said, "when every eye in that hall slid past me like I was furniture, like I was trash to be cleared away. You looked at me. You saw me." His voice dropped lower, warm as embers. "And then you knelt in front of the entire hierarchy and chose me over their gilded dais." Mara's throat tightened. She had. She'd chosen him. In a moment of desperate defiance she hadn't even fully understood herself, she'd walked across that gleaming floor and kissed the hand of the one person in the room even lower than her. "I don't understand any of this," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "You will." Ash shifted slightly, the rags falling away from his face just enough for her to see his expression. He wasn't smiling, but there was something in his features. Recognition, perhaps. Gratitude. "Thank you, Mara," he said, and somehow he knew her name though she'd never spoken it to him. "For seeing me when I needed to be seen. For reminding me what it feels like to be touched without cruelty." The torchlight flickered. In its dancing shadows, Ash no longer looked quite so much like a beggar. He looked like something patient, something waiting.
Chapter 3. The Seer's Whisper. Mara didn't hear the footsteps. One moment she was alone with her thoughts and the steady rhythm of Ash's breathing from the adjacent cell. The next, a figure stood outside the bars, wrapped in midnight blue robes that seemed to drink the torchlight rather than reflect it. Naira. The pack's seer was ancient by shifter standards, her face a map of wrinkles earned through decades of looking where others refused to see. Silver hair fell in thin streams around her hunched shoulders, but her eyes, clouded with cataracts that should have rendered her blind, fixed on Mara with unnerving precision. "Seer," Mara breathed, scrambling to her feet. Hope flared in her chest. "Please, you have to tell Varric this is a mistake. I didn't mean to—" "Hush, child." Naira's gnarled hand shot through the bars, gripping Mara's wrist with surprising strength. Her papery skin was ice cold. "I haven't come to plead your case." The old woman's head tilted, angling toward the cell where Ash sat. But her eyes, Mara noticed, stayed fixed on the wall beside him. Carefully, deliberately, as if looking at him directly would cost something she wasn't willing to pay. "You've done something very old," Naira whispered, her voice crackling like dried leaves. "Very dangerous. Do you understand what you've touched?" "No." Mara's voice came out smaller than she intended. "He's just— Don't." The word cracked like a whip. Naira's fingers tightened painfully on Mara's wrist. Her papery skin was ice cold. "I came anyway, because you need to understand." Mara's heart hammered against her ribs. "Understand what?" Naira leaned closer, her breath smelling of herbs and smoke, and something underneath, something like ozone before a lightning strike. When she spoke, it was barely more than exhaled air, a secret meant for Mara alone. The cage wasn't built to keep him in, it was built to keep the world out. The words hung in the damp air between them, heavy with implications Mara couldn't quite grasp. "What does that— He doesn't need your protection, girl." Naira's clouded eyes finally flicked toward Ash's cell for the briefest instant before jerking away, a shudder running through her bent frame. "We need his mercy,
We've always needed his mercy. The alphas just convinced themselves that if they buried it deep enough, dressed it in rags and kicked it into corners, they could forget what came before them. Before the alphas? Mara heard herself ask. Naira released her wrist, stepping back from the bars. The shadows seemed eager to reclaim her, wrapping around her robes like welcoming arms. Before hierarchy, before order, before we learned to call ourselves civilized, the seer's voice had gone distant, haunted. There were powers that didn't ask for submission, they simply were. And when you kissed his hand tonight, you reminded him that he still is. She turned to leave, her robes whispering against stone. Seer, wait! Pray he remembers kindness, child. Naira's voice drifted back from the darkness. Because when he wakes fully, the only thing standing between this pack and judgment will be whatever mercy you planted in him with that kiss. Then she was gone, and Mara was left trembling in the torchlight, acutely aware of the patient, waiting presence in the cell beside her.
Chapter 4. The First Crack. They dragged them back to the Great Hall at dawn. The ceremony attendees had long since dispersed, but Varric had summoned the council, 12 of the most powerful alphas in the territory, each one radiating dominance like heat from coals. They formed a semicircle on the dais, their expensive suits and cold eyes, a wall of judgment. Varric stood at the center. Crimson robes were placed by black, his face a mask of barely contained fury. The enforcers forced Mara and Ash to their knees in the middle of the marble floor, the same spot where, hours ago, she had crossed the distance between dais and corner, between obedience and defiance. Mara's knees hit the stone hard enough to bruise. Beside her, Ash knelt with that same eerie fluidity, as if his body had simply chosen a new position, rather than being forced into one. "Look at me!" Varric's voice rang out across the hall, sharp and commanding. When neither of them raised their heads immediately, he descended the dais steps, each footfall deliberate, threatening. "I said, look at me!" Mara lifted her eyes. Varric stood close enough that she could see the veins pulsing in his neck, the tension in his jaw. Behind him, the council alphas watched with predatory interest. "You will apologize." Varric's words came out clipped, precise. "You will beg forgiveness for your disrespect to this pack's sacred traditions, and you will submit to your alpha's judgment." He let the words hang for a moment, building pressure. Then he released it. "Submit!" The alpha command hit Mara like a tidal wave. It wasn't just sound, it was force, primal and overwhelming, the weight of thousands of years of pack hierarchy compressed into a single word. Her wolf whimpered and cowered inside her chest. Her spine tried to curve further, her neck desperate to bare itself in instinctive submission.
She felt her lips forming words she didn't want to say. I submit. I'm sorry. But beside her, Ash didn't move. Not an inch. Not a tremble. He knelt there in his rags, head still slightly bowed, breathing steadily as if Varric had merely asked about the weather. The silence that followed was razor-sharp. "I said submit!" Varric's voice cracked with fury and something else, desperation. The command lashed out again, stronger this time, so powerful that even some of the council alphas flinched in their seats. Mara gasped, her entire body shaking with the effort of staying conscious under that much dominance. Her forehead nearly touched the floor. Ash lifted his head, slowly, calmly, and looked Varric directly in the eyes. "No," he said quietly.
The single syllable landed in the hall like a stone in still water. Ripples of unease spread through the council. One alpha's hand gripped his armrest hard enough to make the wood creak. Another leaned back, putting distance between himself and the kneeling figure on the floor. Varric's face had gone white. That's impossible. No wolf can resist an alpha command. No one. I'm not resisting, Ash said, his resonant voice carrying despite its softness. It simply has no hold over me. It never did. A bead of sweat rolled down Varric's temple. Behind him, one of the council alphas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against marble. Varric, we should reconvene, discuss this. Sit down. But even Varric's command to his own council lacked its earlier certainty. The alpha who'd stood hesitated, then slowly lowered himself back into his seat, his eyes never leaving Ash. And in that moment, everyone in the hall understood the same terrible truth. The hierarchy had found something it couldn't break.
Chapter 5. The Elder's Memory. Bram had been sleeping when the whispers reached him. Not the normal gossip that trickled through pack channels like water through cracks. This was different. This was the kind of whisper that carried weight, that made wolves lower their voices and glance over their shoulders. By the time the sun fully crested the mountains, 3 of the younger council members stood at his door, their faces carved with an unease that age had taught him to recognize. Fear of the unknown. He let them in without question, his bones creaking as he settled into the worn chair by his fire. At 93, Bram was the oldest living wolf in the territory, perhaps the oldest in the entire northern region. His fur had gone white decades ago, his movements reduced to careful, measured steps. But his mind remained sharp as a blade, and his memory stretched back further than anyone else's, further than was comfortable. "Tell me," he said simply. The youngest alpha, Marcus, barely 40, still proud, spoke first. "There's a beggar in the cells. He resisted Varric's command, not struggled against it, resisted, like it was nothing. Stood there like Varric was asking him to pass the salt," another added, his voice tight. "I've never seen anything like it." Bram's weathered hands stilled on the arms of his chair. "Describe him." "Filthy, covered in rags. We don't even know his name. He's been around the territory for months, maybe a year. Just another—" "His eyes," Bram interrupted quietly. "Describe his eyes." The 3 alphas exchanged glances. Marcus cleared his throat. Dark, empty almost, but not weak, deep, like looking into a well with no bottom, Bram finished, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "And when he's still, truly still, it's not the stillness of submission, it's the stillness of stone, of mountains, of things that don't move because they don't need to move. You know what he is." It wasn't a question. Bram was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of something he'd hoped never to say aloud again. "Before there were alphas, before we built our hierarchies and our ceremonies and convinced ourselves that dominance was the natural order of things, there were others." He paused, letting the words settle. "We called them world breakers, though that name doesn't quite capture what they were.
are. They didn't break worlds out of malice. They simply existed with such fundamental authority that the world rearranged itself around them. That's a myth, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Stories to scare pups. Is it? Bram's pale eyes found him in the firelight. Tell me, Marcus, if it's just a story, why did your grandfather's grandfather build the council chambers with walls 3 feet thick? Why are there silver chains in every holding cell? Not iron, silver, when silver does nothing to contain ordinary wolves. Why do we have protocols for unresponsive subjects that no living alpha has ever needed to use? The silence stretched. Because someone who came before you remembered. Someone knew that order isn't natural. It's earned, maintained, and most importantly, it's temporary. The alphas didn't inherit the world. They took it from something that stopped caring enough to hold on to it. Stopped caring? The third alpha leaned forward. What does that mean? The world breakers didn't rule through commands or hierarchy. They simply were, and that was enough. But eventually they withdrew, tired perhaps, or bored. They let themselves be forgotten, became shadows, myths, things we could dismiss as superstition. Bram's gnarled fingers drummed once against the armrest. We built our civilization in the space they left behind, built it high and proud, and convinced ourselves we were the apex, that nothing stood above us. Until one of them decides to remember what they are, Marcus said slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes like a cold sunrise. Until someone reminds them, Bram corrected. Until some foolish, brave girl looks at one of these forgotten things and sees a person instead of furniture, sees them with kindness. He met each of their eyes in turn. You can't command something that exists outside your hierarchy. You can't dominate something that was already absolute before you invented dominance, and you certainly can't cage it. Then what do we do? Bram turned back to the fire, watching the flames dance and consume. You pray, he said quietly, that whatever mercy exists in him is stronger than whatever judgment he might decide we've earned. The logs crackled. None of the alphas moved to leave, as if movement itself might draw the attention of something they'd only just learned to fear. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the territory like a voice that had finally remembered how to speak.
Chapter 6. Escalation. Varric paced the length of the great hall like a caged animal, his carefully cultivated composure shredded beyond recognition. The council had dispersed hours ago, their excuses thin and their exits hasty. Only his most loyal enforcers remained, standing at attention along the marble columns, their faces carefully neutral. And in the center of the hall, still on their knees, Mara and Ash waited. You think you can defy me? Varric's voice had gone quiet, which was somehow worse than his earlier shouting. Quiet meant he was thinking, planning. You think that little display of whatever that was changes anything? Ash said nothing. He knelt with that same infuriating stillness, head slightly bowed, breathing steady, existing. It made Varric want to scream. Fine. The Crimson Alpha stopped pacing, turning to face them with something cold and calculated in his eyes. You won't submit to me directly. I understand that now. But everyone breaks eventually. Everyone has a weakness. He walked slowly toward Mara, each footstep deliberate. You care about her, don't you?
Varric circled around Mara like a predator assessing prey. The little nobody who kissed your hand, who saw you when no one else would. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Let's test just how unaffected you really are. Mara's heart hammered against her ribs. Varric, please. His backhand caught her across the face before she could finish the sentence. The impact sent her sprawling across the marble, her cheek exploding with pain. She tasted copper. Blood from her split lip pooled warm and metallic on her tongue. Get up, commanded Varric. Mara's hands shook as she pushed herself back to her knees, her vision swimming. Through the blur of tears, she could see Ash. He hadn't moved, but something in the air had changed. The temperature had dropped just slightly, just enough to notice. Fine. The Crimson Alpha stopped pacing, turning to face them with something cold and calculated in his eyes. Again, Varric said, and struck her once more. This time, Mara cried out, the sound echoing off the stone walls. Her ribs. He'd aimed for her ribs. Pain lanced through her side, sharp and breathtaking. Still nothing? Varric called out to Ash, his voice mocking. No rage, no protective instinct? I thought you were supposed to be something special. He grabbed Mara by her hair, yanking her head back. She whimpered despite herself. Looks to me like you're just a coward in rags. Ash lifted his head. It was a small movement, incremental, but every enforcer in the hall took an involuntary step backward. Let her go, Ash said. His voice was still quiet, still resonant, but underneath it now ran something else, something that made the marble beneath them vibrate ever so slightly. Or what? Varric tightened his grip on Mara's hair, and she gasped as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. What are you going to do, Beggar? You can't even stand without permission. Varric, one of the enforcers, the same one who'd hesitated to touch Ash in the first place, spoke up, his voice strained. Sir, maybe we should… Silence! Varric's free hand shifted, claws extending. He pressed them against Mara's throat, just hard enough to dimple the skin. Not cutting, not yet. I want to see what it takes, what breaks a thing that won't submit. Mara felt the sharp points of his claws, felt her pulse fluttering against them like a trapped bird. She forced herself to look at Ash, to really look at him. His eyes had changed. They were still dark, still bottomless, but now there was something moving in those depths, something vast and ancient stirring from a long sleep. The rags hanging from his frame seemed suddenly less like poverty and more like a restraint he'd chosen to wear. This is your last chance, Ash said, and his voice had dropped an octave, resonating in a frequency that Mara felt in her bones rather than heard with her ears. Let her go. Walk away. Forget this ever happened.
Or what? Varric laughed, but it sounded brittle. You'll finally show us what you really are? Please, I'm counting on it. He pressed his claws deeper. Blood welled up in 4 thin lines against Mara's throat. And somewhere deep in the foundation of the great hall, something cracked. Not the stone, something older than stone. Something that had been sleeping beneath it all, held down by centuries of willful forgetting and deliberate ignorance. Ash stood. Not quickly, not violently. He simply rose to his feet with that same fluid grace, and as he did, every candle in the hall guttered out simultaneously. The shadows didn't just deepen, they rushed toward him like water finding its level, pooling at his feet, climbing his ragged frame like old friends welcoming him home. The enforcers ran, all of them,
Professional loyalty meant nothing in the face of what their hindbrain recognized as primordial danger. Their footsteps echoed through the hall, frantic and retreating, leaving only Varric and his claws at Mara's throat. "Finally," Varric breathed, triumph mixing with terror in his voice. "Finally, you—" Ash looked at him, just looked, and Varric's claws retracted so fast he nearly stumbled backward.
Chapter 7. The Awakening. Varric's claws hung in the air, trembling, halfway between Mara's throat and his own chest. He tried to force them forward again, tried to summon the rage that had driven him moments ago, but his body refused to obey. Every instinct he possessed, alpha dominance, territorial aggression, predatory confidence, had shut down completely, overridden by something older and far more primitive. The survival instinct that recognized an apex predator. Ash took a step forward. It wasn't a threatening movement. He didn't lunge or snarl or bare teeth. He simply walked, one bare foot placing itself in front of the other on the cold marble. But with each step, the great hall responded. The ancient stones groaned in their mortar. The massive wooden doors at the far end shuddered in their frames. The very air grew thick, oppressive, charged with the kind of pressure that precedes a lightning strike. The rags still hung from his shoulders, still draped his frame in filth and tatters. But somehow they no longer looked like poverty. They looked like a costume he'd worn to a performance that had just ended, like a king who'd been playing Beggar and had finally tired of the game. "Step away from her." Ash's voice filled the hall, despite its quietness, resonating in frequencies that human ears weren't meant to hear. The words bypassed Varric's mind entirely and spoke directly to his wolf, which promptly rolled over and bared its throat in submission.
Varric's legs moved without his permission. 3 steps backward, then 4. His hand released Mara's hair as if burned, and she collapsed forward, gasping, her fingers going to the thin lines of blood on her throat. "I don't," Varric's voice cracked. "You can't." "Can't?" Ash tilted his head, and the shadows tilted with him, bending in ways that defied the positioning of the few remaining candles. "Tell me, Crimson Alpha, what do you think commands are?" Varric said nothing, couldn't speak. "Their belief made manifest," Ash continued, moving closer with that same unhurried grace. "You believe you're dominant. You project that belief with enough force that weaker wills accept it as truth. It's a neat trick, elegant even, but it's still just belief." He stopped 3 feet from Varric, close enough that the Alpha could see his own reflection in those bottomless eyes. "I don't need belief," Ash said softly. "I don't need to convince the world of what I am. I simply am, and the world adjusts accordingly. Do you understand the difference?" Varric's knees buckled. He caught himself on one hand, claws scraping against marble, his entire body shaking with the effort of remaining upright. This close to Ash, the weight of his presence was suffocating. It wasn't dominance. Dominance was a wolf standing over another wolf. This was gravity. This was the ocean looking at a raindrop and acknowledging distant kinship before swallowing it whole.
"You hurt her," Ash said. And for the first time, something like emotion entered his voice. Not rage, something colder, more final.
"You drew blood from someone who showed me kindness, who reminded me that I was more than the corner you'd kicked me into." The shadows behind Ash began to coalesce. taking shape, not quite solid, not quite smoke, vast, towering, the suggestion of something with too many angles and not enough mercy. "So now," Ash said, reaching down with one hand to help Mara to her feet, his touch impossibly gentle against her trembling shoulders, "you're going to learn what alphas fear." He looked back at Varric, and his eyes were no longer human at all. "You're going to learn what comes before hierarchy, what you built your thrones on top of, what you spend centuries trying to forget." Varric tried to run. His legs wouldn't move. "Me," Ash finished.
Chapter 8. The Showdown. Varric's shift was explosive. Bones cracked and reformed, flesh rippling as fur erupted across his skin in a wave of crimson. Within seconds, the man was gone, replaced by a massive wolf that stood nearly 7 feet at the shoulder, the pride of his bloodline, the physical manifestation of generations of alpha breeding. His eyes burned gold with feral rage, lips peeling back from fangs the length of daggers. The great hall shook with his roar. This was what Varric knew, what he understood: violence, tooth and claw, the simple mathematics of predator and prey. He'd torn apart challengers twice his size, brought entire rival packs to heel through sheer physical dominance. And this thing in rags would be no different. He lunged. Ash didn't move, didn't shift, didn't even raise his hands in defense. He simply stood there, one arm still supporting Mara, his expression calm as Varric's massive form hurtled toward him with killing intent, jaws wide enough to crush a skull. And then Ash exhaled. It wasn't a sigh, wasn't a breath. It was more like the world itself had been holding something in for centuries and finally released it. The sound, if it could be called a sound, bypassed ears entirely and resonated in the chest, in the bones, in the deepest parts of the brainstem where consciousness ended and pure survival instinct lived. Varric hit the ground mid-leap. Not gently. He crashed down onto the marble with enough force to crack it, his massive body slamming flat as if gravity had suddenly increased tenfold. His legs splayed, his muzzle pressed against stone. A whimper, high, pathetic, utterly involuntary, escaped his throat.
The doors to the great hall burst open. The council alphas who'd fled earlier stood in the entrance, drawn back by some compulsion they didn't understand. Perhaps they'd sensed their leader in danger. Perhaps they thought there was still something they could do. They made it 3 steps into the hall before they too collapsed. All 12 of them, the most powerful wolves in the territory, each one a dominant force in their own right, dropped to the floor like puppets with cut strings. Some tried to crawl backward. Some simply lay there, panting, eyes wide with primal terror. Ash took a step forward, and the pressure in the room intensified. Mara felt it too, but differently. It pressed against her like a hand, but didn't crush, acknowledged her presence without demanding her submission. She realized with a start that she was the only one still standing besides Ash, the only one he was actively choosing not to force down. "Do you know what you are?" Ash's voice carried across the hall, addressing all of them, Varric, the council, the empty spaces where enforcers had fled. "You're children playing king. You learned to project belief and called it dominance. You created hierarchies and called it natural order.
You built a civilization on top of something you couldn't understand, and then convinced yourselves you were the foundation. He crouched beside Varric's massive wolf form. The Crimson Alpha's eyes rolled in terror, his breath coming in rapid, panicked huffs. Up close, Ash looked almost curious, like a scientist examining an interesting specimen. But you're not the foundation, Ash continued quietly. You never were. You're just the current occupants of a house you didn't build. And now the original owner has woken up. Varric tried to snarl. The sound that came out was barely a whimper.
Ash placed one hand on Varric's head, not roughly, almost gently, and the great wolf went utterly still, not from physical restraint, from something deeper, something that reached into Varric's consciousness and reminded him of what he'd always known but spent his entire life denying, that there were things in this world that existed beyond challenge, beyond hierarchy, beyond the petty structures of dominance and submission, things that simply were. I could end you, Ash said, his voice soft enough that only Varric would hear it clearly, though Mara caught the edges. Not out of cruelty, not even out of anger. I could simply decide you no longer exist, and the world would agree with me. Do you understand? Your commands work because wolves believe them. My will works because reality believes me. Varric's massive form trembled. But she asked me not to. Ash's hand moved to scratch behind Varric's ear, the gesture almost absurdly gentle. When you held your claws to her throat, she didn't ask me to kill you. She only asked me to make it stop. So that's what I'm going to do. He stood, turning his back on the paralyzed alphas as if they posed no more threat than furniture. The game is over, Ash announced to the hall. Your ceremony is finished. Your hierarchy is dismissed. Go home. Remember this moment. Remember what you felt when you couldn't move, couldn't fight, couldn't do anything but submit to something you couldn't control. He helped Mara fully to her feet, steadying her as she swayed. Remember, he said, what alphas fear. And with those words, the pressure released.
Chapter 9. The New Dawn. Dawn broke over the territory in shades of gold and amber, indifferent to the upheaval of the night before. Mara stood at the entrance of the great hall, watching the first rays of sunlight cut through the morning mist. Behind her, the hall itself bore the scars of what had happened: cracked marble where Varric had fallen, scorch marks where candles had guttered out in unnatural darkness, the lingering smell of fear that no amount of air would fully clear. The pack had gathered. Not because anyone had called them, not because tradition demanded it. They simply came, drawn by the same instinct that makes animals sense when a storm has passed and it's finally safe to emerge from their dens. They filled the grounds outside the hall, hundreds of them, standing in loose clusters, speaking in hushed voices, all of them waiting to see what came next. Varric was there too. He stood apart from the others, human again, wrapped in a borrowed cloak that hung loose on his frame. He'd shifted back hours ago, after Ash had released the pressure, but something fundamental had broken inside him. The way he held himself, shoulders curved inward, head slightly bowed, eyes fixed on the ground, spoke of a wolf who'd looked into the abyss and found himself wanting. The Crimson Alpha was crimson no longer. He was just a man who'd learned he wasn't what he thought he was. When Mara emerged from the hall, he flinched, not from fear of her, but from the presence beside her.
Ash still wore his rags, still moved with that fluid, unhurried grace. But no one looked past him anymore. No one's gaze slid away as if he were furniture. Every eye tracked him with the kind of attention reserved for natural disasters. Careful, fearful, awed. A path opened through the crowd without anyone consciously moving. People simply found themselves stepping back, creating space, their bodies responding to instincts older than language. Nira stood near the front of the crowd, leaning heavily on her walking stick. When Ash passed, she bowed her head, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, recognition of something that had always been true, but rarely spoken. Brahm was there too, seated in a chair someone had brought for him. The old wolf's eyes met Ash's for a long moment, and something passed between them. Memory, perhaps, or simply the weight of generations, of secrets kept and finally revealed. "What happens now?" someone called out from the crowd. A young wolf, barely 20, brave or foolish enough to give voice to the question everyone was thinking. Ash stopped walking. Mara felt him considering the question, felt the weight of centuries pressing behind his answer. "Now," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled pack without effort, "you decide what kind of pack you want to be, whether you want to rebuild the same hierarchies that crumbled last night or create something different." "And you?" another voice asked. "Will you lead us?" "No." The word was gentle but absolute. "I'm not your alpha. I'm not anyone's alpha. That's the point you still haven't grasped." He gestured to Varric, to the council members scattered through the crowd, to the very concept of hierarchy itself. Leadership earned through dominance alone is just organized violence. It works until something more dominant comes along. He looked down at Mara, and his expression softened into something that might have been a smile. But leadership earned through choice, through trust, through being seen and choosing to see others in return, that's something different. That's something that might actually last. Mara's breath caught. She felt the weight of hundreds of eyes turning toward her, felt the expectation in the air. She wasn't an alpha, wasn't dominant or powerful or any of the things the old hierarchy valued. But she'd been brave when it mattered. She'd seen someone who'd been invisible and chosen kindness over obedience. "I'm not," she started to say. "You knelt in front of the entire hierarchy and kissed the hand of the one they'd kicked into corners," Ash said quietly, for her ears only. "You shattered their ceremony and reminded a dormant god that mercy still exists in this world. Don't tell me you're not enough." He raised his voice again, addressing the pack. "I'm leaving. This isn't my place, and it never was. I only stayed because I'd forgotten I had anywhere else to go. But before I do, I'm going to say this once. The woman beside me has more courage in her smallest finger than your entire council had collectively. What you do with that information is up to you." He began walking again, and Mara found herself moving with him, her hand somehow finding his. The crowd parted before them like water. They passed through the pack's territory in silence, past the grand buildings and manicured grounds,
past the symbols of alpha authority and hierarchical power. With each step, Mara felt something falling away, not just from herself, but from Ash too. The weight of performance, of roles they'd been forced to play. At the border, where packlands gave way to wild forest, Ash finally stopped. He turned to look back at the territory one last time, at the pack that had kicked him, ignored him, treated him as less than nothing. "Will you ever come back?" Mara asked. "Only if I'm needed. Only if someone remembers to see me." He looked at her then, really looked at her, with those ancient, bottomless eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. "Thank you," he said simply, "for the kiss, for the kindness, for reminding me that I'm more than what they tried to make me forget." Mara squeezed his hand. Behind them, the pack watched in silence as the beggar and the nobody walked into the forest together. Not as alpha and subordinate, but as two people who'd chosen to see each other when the rest of the world refused to look. And in that choice, they'd broken something that couldn't be rebuilt the same way. Something new would have to grow in its place. If this story stayed with you, then you're already part of what comes next. The unseen rise here.